need to familiarize themselves with certain concepts. Like safeguarding, the word itself, even in English, is not as clear in meaning and interpretation from one country, from one context to another. So even then, language can be quite tricky because you think you understand what the other person refers to, but actually that may not be the case.
All right, well, here we are again in Rome with the For Pete's Sake podcast. I'm your host, Charlotte Twetton, and I'm joined today by Father Hans Zollner. He's a Jesuit priest, psychologist, and a leading expert in the field of safeguarding. Father Zollner, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And you work now as the director of the Institute of Anthropology here in Rome, and most of your work over the past decade has been in the field of safeguarding and in the prevention of abuse. Tell me, in your memory, when you started this work, when did the church really start taking the prevention of abuse and safeguarding seriously?
I think I could say it's around 2002 when the spotlight cases broke in Boston and the US bishops took on the challenge and promulgated the Dallas Charter, a policy, very strict guidelines and educational efforts. And that was also the time when I discovered the issue more, let me say, more closer to my work as a psychologist and psychotherapist. And we had also a workshop on this in 2004 when we learned how important it is to engage with it and to commit to safeguarding.
Wow. Incredible. And since then, how is the field of psychology and the field of safeguarding have they developed together? Have you seen within the church?
Yeah, it's interesting because we don't have the same situation like in 2002 or in 1985 when the cases in Newfoundland in Canada broke first. That is probably the epicenter of news about child sexual abuse in the church. But since 2002, since 2010, since 2017, there were major steps in the awareness that this is a global issue, in the awareness that this is not something that we can limit only to consider when it comes to children who have been abused, but also adult persons, persons in situations of vulnerability. And from 2019 also the systemic issues, the institutional, the organizational aspect. So in psychology, in sociology, also in theology, we have come a long way and it is an evolving field.
Wow. And you've traveled the world studying this and also teaching many different countries and dioceses, lectures on safeguarding and prevention. That comes with a territory of cultural differences and linguistic differences that some would see as quite a large hurdle. How have you found the best way to combat that linguistic cultural difference, especially in countries that have such a taboo around the topic of abuse and around the topic of safeguarding?
I think the most important thing is that you communicate not only by words, but also by your attitude when you come to a different place, to a different country, to a different environment and continent, that you communicate that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to safeguarding, to prevention of abuse, to talking about sexuality. Each culture, and there are thousands of cultures in each continent, and there are different legislations and there are different expressions in terms of habits, in terms of customs, in terms of language, that you need to realize that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. I have grown up in theology studies in an environment where my language, German, was a minority, and our students, colleagues, were mainly from Africa, Asia. So I learned from very early on that my world is not the only existing, and I had to adapt to other ways of behaving, of communication, of feelings, talking about sensitive issues, including sexuality, including how people pray, how they express their desire to search for God. All this is different in different ways and in different cultures. And then you always need to prepare yourself. You try to find out when you go to a place, who are the people you are talking to? Are they experts? Are they beginners? What is the socio-cultural context in that precise situation, in that institution, this university, in that diocese with this religious congregations? How far have they traveled? And then you try to adjust, always in conversation with the people with whom you are working, because otherwise you go there and you deliver something that you have prefabricated, but that doesn't sit well with the situation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Although I wonder, have you found any specific areas that are more difficult than others when it comes to linguistic differences? Because some languages, at least, you have the connection. You know, you have some common background, you know, you have your language families. But linguistically, that overcoming that hurdle when you have no common background, what do you take a translator with you to those countries that don't have that linguistic background?
Usually, when I go, for example, to some Asian countries, where Korea, Japan, or the like, there are always simultaneous translators, so people from the ground, and they always ask in advance about the material that I'm going to offer. So they need to familiarize themselves with certain concepts, like safeguarding. The word itself, even in English, is not as clear in meaning and interpretation from one country, from one context to another. So even then, language can be quite tricky, because you think you understand what the other person refers to, but actually that may not be the case. So you have always to explain things. And of course, there are bigger difficulties. For example, when you have cultural contexts where conceptual language is not the first choice, but narratives. So better you concentrate on telling stories in such environments that translate what you try to say from a concept into an understandable reality.
Mm-hmm. No, that does make sense. Yeah, even that word safeguarding, when people go to the church and they say there's a big problem and we need a solution, and then the solution is safeguarding. But that word doesn't have a natural, phantasm for most people. Most people don't immediately think, I know what that looks like. How do you define that word, and how do you bring that phantasm to mind when people ask?
First, we have chosen safeguarding as our keyword after years when we were talking always about abuse, about prevention of abuse, protection. First, because people, when they hear about sexual abuse, especially in sexual abuse of minors particularly, just build up a wall. They don't want to listen. They don't want to engage with it. So it comes with a natural, let me say, discomfort. Mm-hmm. So one thing that we want to communicate with the word safeguarding is that this is something that all of us need to be committed to, and all of us can also find something proactive, positive about it. So what I define as safeguarding is creation of safe space, living out safe relationships, and following safe processes. These are the three keywords that define basically everything that we can say at this point about safeguarding within the church, within any environment for society at large, within my life personally. Safe space, safe relationships, and safe processes.
Right. Yeah, I wonder though, because I think when people think keeping safe, they think of strictly the physical boundary, right? That you will stand in between, whatever situation might be uncomfortable and the person who's vulnerable. But it goes far beyond that, because we now know that instances where someone is vulnerable, it's not just physical vulnerability that exists. We now know, especially through the work in psychology and our work in study of anthropology, that many more people are vulnerable than we once thought were vulnerable. You immediately think of someone who's physically vulnerable, like a child, when you think of vulnerability. But what are some instances in which someone might be vulnerable who the common society might not think is vulnerable? This development that there's not just physical abuse, but there might be spiritual abuse. There might be psychological abuse. How have you seen that develop over time? And what now do you perceive as someone who is vulnerable?
Now, first and foremost, the attention given to other types of abuse beyond the sexual abuse or the physical maltreatment, these were the two areas that were basically always in the focus of psychology and psychiatry especially, has grown out of a sensitivity towards spiritual abuse, psychological abuse, emotional abuse that has grown exponentially over the last, let me say, 6 years, maybe even you can say after the pandemic or during the pandemic, when we got much more attention given to that, also in research and teaching. And when things that have been always with us, like spiritual abuse has always been there, were seen much more as a major problem. That wasn't the case 10 years ago. It doesn't say that there was nobody talking about it, but the attention that we have seen over the last, especially 2 or 3 years, when, for example, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of Faith has now established a working group on the definition of what does spiritual abuse in the church look like and how should it be dealt with, also in canonical terms, shows that there is something new that wasn't there before. But let me come back to another aspect that is so obvious to basically all of us that we don't realize that safe space, safe relationship, and safe processes refers also to another world, not only to the physical world, that is the digital space. The digital space in which most people live today, at least a great deal of their life, and all of the young people in this world, except for maybe very few percentage, live in that digital world probably more than in the real world. And safe space refers also to the digital space, to relationships that are very often becoming easily abusive also in the digital space, and where the processes don't work, for example, in the safeguarding of vulnerable people.
Yeah. That is so true, but also it's so difficult to place those regulations on a digital sphere, because you don't want, well, at least in America, we have a culture of freedom of speech, and you're combating this, right, where people should be allowed to say anything at any point, but at the same time, you're trying to protect the ears, so to say, of vulnerable people. What have you seen that's worked when it comes to protection in the digital sphere?
Yeah, the ethical question at the bottom of everything is, how do we reconcile freedom of speech and protection of the vulnerable people, especially young people? And there is no easy way out. In the European Union, for basically 2 decades, there was a discussion precisely on this tension there. And there were advocates for freedom of speech talking about, let me say, any restrictions and any interventions from any company, social media company or governments, would immediately lead to the danger of dictatorship or control and suppression of different opinions. Honestly, I don't see that happening, at least as far as I'm concerned. On social media, I don't see that restriction happening at the moment. On the other side, we need to understand that young people, when they are exposed to imagery, for example, child sexual abuse material, or pornography, or violent incitement of radicalization, political, let me say, ideology, and so forth, you understand that young people are much more vulnerable. There are also adults in the same category of vulnerability, but probably much less than young people. And the younger you go, of course, there is much higher risk that they can then end up caught in a circle of violence or being victims of abuse.
Yeah, it is such a massive issue. And we have this development of the digital world happening so quickly. And with that comes all of these dangers in such a massive way. I know there was a case with the Meta AI universe where they were trying to figure out their legal policy of prevention and protection of any young people who were using it. And it was almost impossible because you couldn't keep up with the technological advances and you couldn't keep up with the people evading any regulation they had put into place. At the start of an AI revolution, do you think is that when you start the legality? And how do you convince the people who are making money off of it that it's worth it to actually have a legal aspect?
Yeah, in 2017, we organized at the Gregorian, together with partners Telefono Azzurro and the Child Dignity Alliance, a very high-level meeting on child dignity in the digital world. In 2025, early in March, we had a conference here organized with Child Foundation from Sweden and the Pontifical Academy for Science on the risks and challenges and opportunities of AI and the safeguarding of children. So what you see is that the stakeholders, especially the companies, social media companies that make tons of money out of these instruments and apps and whatever you have, are not sensitive enough. At least they don't come to the point where they see their own responsibility in protecting children and others from this type of abuse. So AI has now created the opportunity to produce films or material of brutal abuse of infants. Yeah. And there's no real person involved in that. It's all artificial. But still the question is, who is responsible for this? Who is selling it? And what happens to the brain of those people who are consuming that type of material? Yeah. There is not much debate really going on, and there's not much awareness in society at large that this creates major problems in terms of how we relate to each other, how sexuality is seen, how the roles and the reality of the gender, male and female, are lived out and are expected to be lived out, and so forth. So in 2017, Pope Francis gave a seminal speech on that, and it is still true, in which he calls on the companies to own their own responsibility in terms of investing a small part would be sufficient, a small part of their revenues to really do what they can do. It's not that they can't. If they want to exclude somebody, if they want to block somebody, if they want to cut out some content, they are capable of doing that in no time. What they don't want to do is to cut that out, what is really harmful, because they lose too many customers and they lose money. And this is all about where we need to come into a much more focused discussion, also working on the CEOs and the movers and shakers in that type of industry, because if we don't get them on board, this will grow and grow as a huge problem.
Yeah, I think there is this sort of idea in postmodernist philosophy that sexuality is at its healthiest and its most pure, so to say, when you just let it run free. And having no regulation is the most fulfilling to the person. And they say this when it comes to a solution to clerical abuse, where they'll say, well, your problem is that you stamped down the priest's sexuality, and it's celibacy that's the problem, and it's causing all these instances. What is your response when people suggest that as a solution? And have you seen that in your work? Have you seen that that is the case?
Now, the short answer is celibacy does not lead to abusive behavior as such. And this is said and proven by all reports commissioned by governments, conducted by research institutions outside the church, by any type of report that we have had over the last 25, 30 years. There is always one sentence that says celibacy is not the monocausal reason for abusive behavior. So it's not that celibacy or chastity lead people to become abusers as such, chastity as such, or celibacy as such. You see it also on the other side when you go into reports on abusive behavior by non-Catholic clergy, like we had in Germany 2 years ago. There was a report coming out for the 17 Lutheran churches in Germany, regional churches, and the percentage, the proportion of male married pastors who had abused minors of age sexually was in the same range as the proportion of clergy, Latin, Roman, celibate clergy in Germany. So it's not a celibate problem as such. What I always add is, however, that it's not celibacy as such. That is clear, and this is scientifically proven. What is also clear is that celibacy can become, over time, in living out celibacy, but it can surely become a problem when celibacy is not integrated in a healthy, spiritual, and human life. And that is the reason why we underline of late that it is important that we look into the lifestyle of priests, into the workload, and also in the relationships. That has to do with the initial formation and seminary formation, and it has to do with the permanent, the continuous formation of priests after ordination. Because the average age of a priest who abuses for the first time, average age, is of 39 years. That is not the newcomer into priesthood. This is not a 25-year-old who has just left seminary, but a person who has grown into mid-age and has lived through moments of loneliness, overwork, and so forth. So we know that celibacy can become a risk factor if the environment, the living style, the relationships are not healthy and spiritually based enough.
Right. That is interesting because you talk about the priest as a whole human, right, instead of just one aspect. Because I think when people think of abuse, they think just the physical aspect, instead of thinking about what actually might cause it being the entirety of the life. Is that part of the reason for the change in your institution? I know the Institute of Anthropology was once called the Center for Child Protection, and the name got changed to the IADC, which carries with it quite a more extensive study than just protection. It's anthropology, just human life itself. Was that part of the reason why you changed it? Was that shift in understanding?
Yeah, sure. And this is also one of the signs where you see that how much within the church and society the debate, the discussion, and research has gone on. When we started in 2012, the Center for Child Protection, the focus was on psychology, on law, and how to protect children. Over time, we realized that the concentration on psychiatry, psychology, and law alone doesn't really help us to understand the context of abuse and the context of cover-up of abuse and denial and phenomena like clericalism and so forth. This has to be analyzed from different points of view, in different academic disciplines like sociology. We need to look into administration, communication. So there is a full range of disciplines and approaches scientifically and in lived life that come into the picture when we need to really safeguard people. And that brought us to the name of Institute of Anthropology, Interdisciplinary Studies on Human Dignity and Care, which also wants to connote the positive aspect. We want to work for human dignity and care from the different angles that you have when you look at human life. So in fact, I'm very happy about the name today because anthropology gives us the opportunity to work with all disciplines, with experts from all fields, to help us to understand better what brings people to abuse and how can we build up a world and a church that is safer for all.
It is so true because I think the idea that you can combat it by focusing on one aspect was what most people's first thought is when it comes to combating abuse within the church and in the world as a whole. But it, over time, seems to have not been as efficient as everyone thought it was. If you just think of the human as strictly physical or strictly sexual, it doesn't provide the in-depth analysis or understanding that actually prevents and actually protects the society. So I think the work is more well-rounded and more about the entirety of the human. But anthropology is not what you first think of when you think of the study or the care or the protection of vulnerable people. And so anthropology is such a funny word to associate with your institute. I think a lot of people would sort of be a little confused. Do you get that very often? People sort of confused as to what it is you all do there.
Actually, they get more confused because the CCP, the Center for Child Protection, as we were known till 2021, was already a world-known brand, at least in the Catholic Church. And then when we changed to IADC, people were confused about that. But when we explain why we changed to anthropology, and when you read the subtitle, Interdisciplinary Studies on Human Dignity and Care, then they understand. And actually, I don't know any Institute or Faculty of Anthropology that has not a specific subtitle, because anthropology is as broad as you can get, and you always need to indicate what is your focus. That within the human person, we need to work from different angles, from psychology, from the way how we relate to each other, how we express our concerns, and that brings, for our field, a new light to a phenomenon that is worldwide and that has been with humanity since ever. And the confusion that many people have and the repulsion that they feel comes from a very, very deep-seated uncomfortableness that you don't want to listen to things that have to do with abuse and sexual abuse, and especially sexual abuse of minors. That is deeply seated in, I believe, in our evolutionary development as human beings. So taking it on and bringing it also to an understanding that this harms not only the body, not only the spirit, if you wish, but also the soul. So it's not only a psychological phenomenon that leaves traces or physical maltreatment. It has also to do with a spiritual harm, especially when the person who offends, the perpetrator, is representing a spiritual reality, the church, any religion. If it is a priest or if it is a lay person or a male or female consecrated person who is abusing, it's not only that person in front of you that takes advantage of you as in a situation of vulnerability. It is a person that represents God. And therefore, for many victims of abuse, this is probably the deepest wound of all. And therefore, I'm really, really astonished that till now, very few theologians have taken it on, and there's very little spiritual and liturgical ways of confronting ourselves with it. How many people pray for victims of abuse? We pray for the poor, for the homeless, for the sick in the prayer of faithful. But how many people pray in liturgy and personally for victims of abuse within the church and outside the church? So it shows that we really need still to come a long way so that we understand the spiritual harm that is being done to victims, especially when we talk about abuse that happens within the church by church representatives.
Yeah, because it carries more with it than perhaps other forms of suffering. It reaches the depth of the soul. And I think also people look to the church as an example in all areas of teaching. We look to the church as an example of charity. We look to the church for an example of humility. We look for the church an example of chastity. But looking to the church as an example for how to deal with perpetrators within your community, whether or not those perpetrators are clerical or if they're lay, many Catholic communities that I know personally look to the church and say, okay, well, in my community, we now know that this person treated their wife this way, or we now know in this community, this person treated this child this way, or this person treated their whatever it is this way. What does the church do? How can I follow the church's example in this way? But what is the church's current protocol for dealing with instances of confirmed abusers? What is the church's standard on how, as a community, we should handle these cases?
Now, there are the legal and the canonical considerations, norms and laws, but that is not all. And especially in an Anglo-Saxon context, I've seen this in the US, in Australia especially, where you have a very litigious society and a very law-oriented society. That is not the case in all other places around the globe. The expectation is that by promulgating a new law, putting in place a new norm, you solve the problem. That is not the case. Otherwise, we wouldn't have abuse going on in the church, because there have been new laws, there have been new norms over the last, especially in the last 25 years. However, that is not sufficient, but it is the condition to do other things. So first, the church has made it very clear that we need to follow the law in the state and then the country in which we live. The church is not a body set apart. We are citizens of a nation, and we have to abide with and follow the laws and the norms of that state and that country in which we live, if they don't go against religious freedom. Secondly, that is not enough. We need to do our bit also within the church's environment. Therefore, we have canon law, church law, that is not a substitute to state law, but an addition. So in terms of dealing with the allegations of abuse, now we talk about sexual abuse, but we talk also about other types of abuse since 2019. We talk about the restrictions of freedom and so forth. There are clear procedures. So, for example, a bishop or a provincial receives an allegations of sexual abuse against a minor committed by one of his priests or religious. Then the major superior, or the ordinary, as we say, the bishop or the provincial, have to start a preliminary investigation into the truthfulness of that allegation. In any case, at the end of that process, the bishop or the provincial need to send the result to the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, that then determines what is going to happen next in terms of canonical procedure. The result being that the case is found truthful or not. In any case, it goes to the DDF, as we say. So this is the legal side and the canonical side. But apart from that, we also need to learn that within the church, we don't listen to victims of abuse. We don't do justice to the victims, those who have been abused, but we don't listen really, and we don't do justice also to the perpetrators of abuse, which is a very, very big question also of charity and of justice. First, of course, justice needs to be done in regard to the victims. So whatever type of accompaniment, whatever type of compensation they are entitled to receive, they should. On the other side, having said that, we also need to turn our attention to the perpetrators, and be it only for the purpose of safeguarding, because we know that people who have abused others are much more likely to abuse again, even after having served a prison term or having undergone therapy of any type. Many, unfortunately, then re-offend. So therefore, in terms of safeguarding in the future, it is important that we accompany psychologically, humanly, spiritually, also the perpetrators who have harmed other people, who have harmed the church, who have harmed their own lives, but they are still human beings, and we need to really own that. Unfortunately, again, there's not much being done in the church and in society at large.
Yeah, because I've heard people suggest that the best move forward for known perpetrators who have that tendency to recommit is just to send them away, to go become a hermit infinitely. Generally, as a church, however, is that holding the hand with, that soul, as well as the souls who have been hurt, is that the best move forward, to just ship them off, to isolate them? Because there is no standard that I know of how to deal with reoffenders, and there's no, at least, cultural understanding of what the best practices are. Although everyone on the lay side always says, why don't we just ship them off somewhere? Why don't we just isolate them from society as a whole? What do you respond to that suggestion?
Yeah, how would you isolate a person? So one big question is, what should every perpetrator be automatically dismissed from the clerical state or from religious life? We have discussed that question very, very seriously with Ending Clergy Abuse, a survivors network worldwide, in 2024, and we discussed the question of zero tolerance in terms of, is everybody who has been accused or convicted of child sexual abuse automatically dismissed from the clerical state? The answer that we came up with, together with the survivors' representatives, was no, not necessarily. Precisely for that reason that we were mentioning before, that casting out a person, trying to isolate, or even the dismissal from the clerical state not automatically makes them safer people. To the contrary. We have cases where clergy who had abused and were sentenced and were dismissed from the clerical state in the United States, in one state, moved to another state. There was no sex register communication, so they hired them as football trainers or in any type of activity where they could access youth again. And of course, they reoffended. So the question is, how can we control people as long as necessary and as strictly as necessary? And that is very often not possible anymore when the person has been dismissed from the clerical state or from religious life, because then the church has no say. They are citizens, and they would surely accuse the church of interfering with their privacy and their private lives. So it is a very difficult challenge that we face. How can we keep people as safe as necessary, respecting their own decisions, but also respecting the sensitivity of church faithful and other people who say, why don't you kick out such a person? Now, even if you send them to all the monasteries, even if you populate all the archives in church institutions, that wouldn't suffice to put all these people. And then who is supervising them? Mm-hmm. So we need to invest in this type of safety considerations, safety concepts that are viable. And here I see a huge possibility in the Catholic community, especially in societies and churches in countries where the community factor is much more prevalent and important for church life than in Western societies at large. I see this as an opportunity for the church in Africa and Asia to develop models in which not only victims, which would also be an important asset for that type of accompaniment, but also for perpetrators. The community needs to take more responsibility.
Yeah. In what way does a community take responsibility? What are some practical steps that you see a community knowing this perpetrator exists and that it's among them, and then also knowing the victims are there? What are those steps? How can a community help?
We don't have many models for that. So what I think of is that there are a group of people, volunteers, who have some type of background, for example, in counseling or treatment or law enforcement, who would come up and say, okay, we have this perpetrator, be it a clergy or non-clergy, in our midst here. And we, 5-7 people, each one of us takes care of that person and monitors and supervises that person for 1 day a week. And we control what that person is doing every half an hour. Online, in meeting with people, in his working place, in access to whatever other means they have, and especially in meeting with people. So we make sure, as much as humanly speaking we can, that person doesn't get close to committing again abuse.
Right. A complicated, difficult task, undoubtedly. And I think there are some people that are sort of thrown in the towel, so to say, that they look at that, that solution, that as a community we come together, we hold the person within the community, and that's where we take care of them, and we ensure that they get the psychological help, that they have the management, that they have the people caring for them in order to heal their own soul in many ways. But a lot of people, I know there are canon lawyers in the United States who suggest to victims to not go back to the church for any system of justice, to just go through the civil justice system, because there's nothing that the church can give them, and they've seen so many instances where it hasn't gone right, to say. Is there ever a time in which the church will be sufficient for justice on its own, or should the church always maintain that civil aspect, always working within the country? Is there also a chance that in some instances it's better for the victim to only go through the civic system?
Now, the principle that the church itself has communicated to the bishops and to everybody in the church is that we follow law in the state and the country. Period. Secondly, if there is no hope that within a church institution, be it a diocese or religious congregation, province or whatever, church, a school, Catholic school system or whatever, you as a victim can expect some sense of justice, then of course you forget about it and you go only through the civil and the penal processes of the state and the country. However, very often, unfortunately, in many places at least, the legal system doesn't help the cases and the causes of those victims and survivors. And I know of a number of them who entered into such a public also display of allegations and so forth, who were then deeply disappointed that the state didn't do what they were expected to do, and most importantly, they didn't find inner peace. They didn't find the healing, the reconciliation that they were looking for. Sometimes not even the sense of justice, and that is very, very sad for them, because then what else is left? They have forgone their hope in the church procedure. They were deeply disappointed by the state procedure. So it's very difficult to keep on going. So what we see also is that in many cases, laws and the legal approach are not sufficient. A victim of abuse wrote to me a few weeks back from Germany. He had gotten a huge amount of money for European German standards as a reparation payment awarded by the civil tribunal against a diocese. A layperson employed by the diocese was an employee. Mm-hmm. So a huge amount of money. But that victim of abuse who got that huge amount of money writes to me and says, I'm deeply disappointed and I'm deeply sad that the diocese, once they had paid their check, broke off any communication with me. And there was no sense of a relationship, there was no spiritual help, there was no support whatsoever on another side. So which showed to me, as expressed by this victim, that the legal justice is not the only one that, and certainly not the one that satisfies your own sense of justice and your own sense of healing.
What is your recommendation then for people looking to heal after being victims of abuse? What satisfies, in your experience, that desire for peace? What brings that about?
That is always a personal journey, and what I learned over the last 20, 25 years since working in this, there is no response that would be valid for each victim and survivor. It is a very personal and individual journey, and that is the challenge for the church, because we would, as a church, we would need to offer a set of different approaches. Some victims are believers still. Some go to church, probably many more than we think. Mm-hmm. Some don't. Some pray. Some have a spiritual leaning, but they don't identify as belonging to an institutional religion anymore. So some want money. Others don't want money. Some want psychological treatment. Some don't expect that. So you have always to enter into a dialogue with that particular person who has been harmed by the church and try to find out together with the person what the church needs to offer, can offer. And then only you will find out what is more helpful for this person. I've seen people who have come a long way and who would say that they feel themselves at peace with their history, their story, and others who will be angry forever. Acknowledging that one is a victim, and that is also an entitlement to feel like a victim and to express that victimhood in different ways, is one way that you as a church community and as a church responsible, should be willing to do.
Yeah. It is so complex, and there is still so much work to be done. And in 2019, when Pope Francis held the abuse conference, or the abuse summit, I should say, he promised to bring this is a quote from him, the wrath of God upon perpetrators of clerical abuse or anything of the sort within the church. And from that summit, generally 3 words came about, which were transparency, responsibility, and accountability. In your opinion and in your experience, has the church upheld that promise of those 3 dimensions and that promise to protect its people?
I think we have made many steps in some places, at least, in terms of transparency, accountability, and compliance responsibility. We have made steps. We have, for example, a new law that for the first time spells out a system of co-responsibility, co-accountability of bishops when it comes to negligence in the duty of office, not in abuse, but in the how bishops and provincials deal with allegations of abuse against priests in their dioceses and provinces. So we have something, let me say, that shows that there is a seriousness and that a number of bishops have been asked to step down because of cover-up, because of neglectfulness in dealing with allegations and so forth. So we have had a few cases, at least, where those principles were upheld and enforced. I don't dare to say that the church has kept its promise, because the church is very diverse. If you look into the 112 bishops' conferences, the thousands and thousands of religious congregations and orders in the 220,000 Catholic schools, and so forth and so forth. So we are not a uniform body. There is a huge diversity also in the speed in how these things are put in place. And let me give you one example where we come back to the cultural aspect and the linguistic aspect. When we organized the Child Protection Summit in 2019, in the organizing committee, we discussed the 3 days that we proposed then as the topics to Pope Francis. And one topic was accountability. Now, in English, it sounds pretty clear, and you have a German equivalent also as a noun. But when we came to discuss the translation of transparency, compliance, and accountability into the Romanic languages, we realized that there is no noun, no substantive, neither in Italian, nor in Spanish, nor in French, nor in Portuguese, that would translate accountability in any of these languages in which the great majority of Catholics live. They don't live in the English or the German-speaking countries. They live in those Romanic-speaking countries. Mm-hmm. So if you don't have a word, accountability in this case, what does that mean? It means you don't think about it. It means you don't speak about it. And surely it means you don't act accordingly. So the concept of accountability is foreign to Romanic thinking and acting. Now, let that sink in and compare it to the standards of accountability that we have in companies worldwide, that we have also in state and government, and then apply it to our situation in the church. So there's a long way to really come not only to a legal change, because we have now accountability in church language and law, but what is more important is a change of mentality. And that is something that comes about only over generations. That is very sad for victims. That is very sad for people who look for a substantive and substantial change within church procedure. But that is reality, especially if you look into the church worldwide.
Yeah. That difficulty of the church being a universal church. It encompasses so many different aspects. Is that your, looking into the future, is that your main goal with the Institute of Anthropology? Is the educational prevention, the before anything happens, that you acknowledge the human being as a whole, before any allegations, before any problems, and you maybe are able to see any potential problems much sooner now that we have this fuller understanding of the person. Is that your goal when you look at the Institute?
The Institute has been established in 2012, in the time of Pope Benedict still, as an academic unit within the Pontifical Gregorian University. So it is pretty clear that our first purpose is teaching and research in an academic university institution. So we continue our diploma programs, our certificate courses, our licentiates, our master programs in safeguarding, our doctorates in anthropology. We reach out to people through our e-learning program, to people and institutions, I should say. So this is our main goal. Our main goal is also to understand what really safeguards people. What are the most effective measures of safeguarding? Because scientifically speaking, we don't know yet. In no discipline, we have a clear vision of what is more effective. Is it the guidelines? Is it educational efforts? Is it awareness raising? Or what is it that really prevents abuse and creates safe space, safe relationships, and safe processes? This is our purpose and this is our goal with which we want to contribute in dialogue with church and beyond the church institutions, in dialogue with state partners, governments, and researchers from all ways of life and from all disciplines. This is our work, and we are very happy that we can really rely on a huge number of experts with whom we work from different continents, and with which we have also the opportunity to organize conferences like the International Safeguarding Conference every year, in which we bring together the personnel, the church personnel, but also of late also other people from outside the church who are engaged in this work.
Yeah, because it's work for the church, but it reflects the world as well. Well, Father, thank you so much for coming on For Pete's Sake. It's been such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much.
This has been For Pete's Sake, the podcast. Join us next week, and don't forget to like and subscribe.